a fair shake for me.
Sunday night at 8 Eastern and Pacific on C-SPAN's Q&A. Up next, a discussion on religion, politics, and social issues in American history. Scholars look at the influence of Christianity in politics, the history of Muslims in America, and how religion currently influences the immigration debate. Held at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, this is about an hour, 25 minutes.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here from St. Louis. I'm Lori Maffley-Kipp. I'm at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University. And my job is to very briefly introduce our panelists for this session. I'm keeping the introductions very brief. I've told them I've already cut out the Nobel Prizes and some other things that they've done just to make sure we get to their talks quickly. So here we go. Edward J. Blum is professor of history at San Diego State University. He'll be our first presenter. He is the co-author of The Color of Christ, The Son of God, and the Saga of Race in America, 2012, and the author of W.E.B. Du Bois' American Prophet, 2007, and Reforging the White Republic, Race, Religion, and American Nationalism, 1865 to 1898, from 2005. Blum has been awarded the Gustav O. Arlt Award in the Humanities by the Council of Graduate Schools for the best first book by a historian published between 2002 and 2009, the Peter Seaborg Award for the best book in Civil War Studies in 2006, and the C. Vann Woodward Dissertation Prize. His writings have also been featured at CNN.com, The Atlantic, Newsweek, and the New York Times. His presentation for this morning is entitled, In the Bowels of a Free and Christian Country. Our next presenter will be Rebecca Goetz, Associate Professor of History at New York University. Professor Goetz received her PhD in 2006 from Harvard University. A historian of early North America, she specializes in the history of race and slavery. She also has broad interests in the history of the Atlantic world and in comparative colonialisms in North America and the Caribbean. She teaches courses at the undergraduate and graduate level on many aspects of early American history. Her first book, The Baptism of Early Virginia, How Christianity Created Race, was published in August 2012. Professor Goetz is a crazy cat lady, and despite living in New York City, remains a rabid Red Sox fan. Her paper for today is entitled Barack Hussein Obama, the First Muslim President. Our third presenter is Arlene Sanchez-Walsh from Azusa Pacific University, where she is an associate professor of church history and Latina church studies. Her first book, Latino Pentecostal Identity, Evangelical Faith, Self, and Society, won the Hispanic Theological Initiative's Book Award in 2005. She has authored more than a dozen articles and book chapters on the subject of Latina Pentecostalism, and has served as a media expert for outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and On Being with Krista Tippett. She also served as an expert on Latina religious history for the PBS series Religion in America. Sanchez-Walsh's current projects include a textbook on Pentecostalism in America and a monograph on race, ethnicity, and the prosperity gospel. Today she'll be talking about immigrant sanctuaries and divine borders. Finally, Kevin M. Schultz from the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he's an associate professor of history, Catholic studies, and religious studies, and also associate chair of the Department of History. A native of Los Angeles, Kevin M. Schultz teaches 20th century American history and has special interests in religion, ethno-racial history, and American intellectual and cultural life. His first academic monograph, Tri-Faith America, How Post-War Catholics and Jews Held America to Its Protestant Promise, charted the decline of the idea that the United States was a Christian nation and the subsequent rise of the notion that the country was premised on something called Judeo-Christianity. Professor Schultz's current work examines the fascinating intertwined lives of William F. Buckley Jr. and Norman Mailer as a way to explore and better understand the pivotal decade of the 1960s. He also has had essays appear in several of the profession's flagship journals, including the Journal of American History, American Quarterly, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and Labor History, as well as other distinguished outlets, both popular and academic. And his talk for today is entitled, The Blessings of American Pluralism.
Good day. Is the United States a Christian country? Was it one in the past? Will it be in the future? If we look high and low, near and far, we can observe Americans asking, answering, and debating these questions. They are disputed online, plastered on billboards, mentioned during news programs, and addressed by leading politicians. The questions and the answers rattle with disagreement and with tension. Barack Obama, for instance, answered them one way before he was president, and then quite differently after. In 2008, he told a group in Washington, D.C., "We are no longer just a Christian nation. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, a Buddhist nation, a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers." 3 years later, now speaking as President Obama, and to a very different audience in Turkey, Obama explained, "We do not consider ourselves a Christian nation, or a Jewish nation, or a Muslim nation." His both-and embrace of pluralism had somehow been reconfigured into a neither-nor repudiation of particulars. Most political and Christian conservatives share their disapproval of Obama, but they are anything but united on this matter of religious nationalism. "It's not hate speech," cried radio and television host Glenn Beck, to defend the United States as a Christian nation in 2010. In the 2000 book, Faith and Politics, Senator John Danforth maintained, "Some people have asked me whether America is a Christian country. The answer must be no. For to call this a Christian country is to say that non-Christians are some lesser order, not full-fledged citizens of one nation." These recent debates and disagreements are not new. The problem of what it means to be or not to be a Christian nation has been a touchstone of conversations about religion and politics for more than 2 centuries. I want to take us back to the Age of Revolution and turn our attention to a cast of forgotten founders, a group of men who harnessed the language of Christian nationalism in poignant and meaningful ways. This small and overlooked cohort of Bostonians may offer some new ways for us today to consider what's at stake when we speak the vexed political problem of the nation's religion. The year was 1777. The month was January. A petition on behalf of a great number of blacks was presented to the newly formed Massachusetts Bay State Legislature. It was signed by 8 men, and the petition declared, "We are detained in a state of slavery in the bowels of a free and Christian country." The bondsmen, they borrowed freely from the language of the Declaration of Independence. Itself was only 6 months old. They have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind. They and others like them had been unjustly dragged to this land. They had been brought here to be sold like beasts of burden. This all happened among a people professing the mild religion of Jesus. What these men experienced, they called worse than non-existence. We could engage religion and politics in their petition from a variety of angles. Their description of the religion of Jesus as mild could lead us to consider the potent rise of Methodism during the century and its musical inventions of songs like Gentle Jesus, Meek and Mild, or what it means to have a mild faith in a time of war. The petitioner's invocation of natural and inalienable rights could lead us to wonder about the theological tensions between deism and revealed Christianity that animated so much of the revolutionary period. For our time, I would like to zero in on two words: bowels and beasts. With them, the men of Boston discussed politics and religion, not solely as abstracted issues of ideas or beliefs, but also as concepts of flesh and bone. These were human activities that took place within, and through bodies. Their rhetorical emphasis on bodies encompassed the private and the public, the allegorical and the literal, the biblical and the civil. So let's begin in the bowels, a hallmark destination of medieval and Enlightenment discourse. Dante structured his 14th century poem Inferno as a journey that began in the mouth, flowed into the stomach, and culminated in excremental expulsion. Martin Luther described the Pope repeatedly as a farting rear end. He didn't use the word rear end. Around the same time that John Locke was putting together his second treatise on government, he was also penning an entire chapter on the importance of going to stool regularly for some thoughts concerning education. When slaves situated themselves rhetorically in the bowels of the country, they presented the nation as a body. There were both Christian and Enlightenment backdrops for this kind of corporeal mapping. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul told believers, "It is by one Spirit we are all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles, whether we be bond or free." The body of hands and feet, of eyes and ears, is not one member, but it's many. While bodies were made of many parts, the pieces were equally valued and valuable within the one body of the faith family. Bodies were crucial civil and political metaphors too. In the age of monarchy, the king's body carried a variety of meanings. European kings were thought to have two bodies. Their physical bodies could decay, but the body politic that they symbolized was understood to be timeless, to be immutable, and to be composite. The visual frontispiece for Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan presented the top half of the sovereign facing the viewer. But the top half of the sovereign was actually hundreds of small, individualized bodies. While book viewers looked upon the face and the chest of the crowned sovereign, they witnessed only the backsides of the smaller depicted bodies, which we saw from the rear. Members of the society face into the sovereign. They constitute the body politic. They are absorbed into the sovereign, and they are put into motion by the sovereign. It is a case of bodies within a body. Now, the Apostle Paul, he never mentioned the bowels in his list of body parts. Hobbes did. When discussing those things that weaken a commonwealth, Hobbes lashed out at the great number of corporations, by this he meant towns, which are, as it were, many lesser commonwealths in the bowels of a greater. They are like worms in the entrails of a natural man. Bowels were a terrible place to be, no doubt, but they were also a danger to the rest of the body. In colonial Massachusetts and elsewhere, slaves were often feared for poisoning their masters in ways that upset their bowels, crippling and killing women and men slowly through what was put into their mouths that then came out of other locations. What took place within and through bowels could upset the entire body. While the reference to bowels took us within bodies, the mention of being sold like beasts of burden, that drives us to consider what is done with bodies. Dehumanization and animalization were crucial aspects of making a slave culture. Linguistic strategies and physical activities oftentimes rendered the enslaved as akin to, if not equal with, domesticated animals. In response, generation after generation of African Americans damned their treatment as analogous to that of animals, oftentimes claiming that the ultimate goal of enslavement was to transform humans into beasts. Now, beasts of burden were particular entities in British law and husbandry. English poor laws, for instance, they differentiated those individuals who traveled with one beast of burden or more. This was a way to construct a hierarchy of poverty. Who should get help? Beasts of burden were generally recognized as able to do two things, sometimes at the same time. They could carry loads on their backs, and they could haul weighty cargo. The Massachusetts petitioners, they were not the only ones using this beast of burden language and using it to speak about human relationships. Scottish minister and historian William Robertson, when he wrote A History of the Discovery and Settlement of America, he denounced Native American men for treating their wives as no better than a beast of burden. While the men loiter, the women are condemned to incessant toil. The King James Bible was replete with references to both beasts and burdens. The book of Genesis described how God formed every beast of the field. In the book of Isaiah, too heavy a burden was placed on cattle when they were asked to carry idols. And then later in the book of Daniel, there are 4 terrifying beasts. And by the book of Revelation, the beast was a leading figure. And this beast was well known to colonial and revolutionary ministers. For earlier Massachusetts church leader Cotton Mather, the humanity of slaves and not their beastliness, that was an embattled point that needed to be defended. Mather considered humane regard for the enslaved to be both right Christian theology and effective domestic policy. Christianizing slaves, he wrote bluntly, will make better servants. It will render them afraid of speaking or doing anything that may justly displease you. He's writing to masters here. Masters will have more work done for them and better done than those inhumane masters who have used their Negroes worse than their horses. To the question of whether Negroes have rational souls, Mather exploded. Let that brutish insinuation be never whispered again. They are men and not beasts. Beastliness, inhumanity, brutishness. These were characteristics of slaveholders behaving badly, not essences of the enslaved themselves. So for the petitioners, animalization, it was both general and particular. They're not simply beasts, but beasts of burden. They carried emotional and physical weight, metaphorical and literal weight. It was a weight that rested heavily on the consciences of some free whites, like Cotton Mather. It was a weight that the petitioners hoped they could leverage with the legislature. Seeing that I'm close to out of time, I want to suggest that taking the insights of these petitioners into our present, that it may provide some new bridges for us to cross the religious and political divides that fracture the contemporary United States. What if we began where the petitioners did, in bodies connected to other bodies, and then moved to our ideas about whether the nation is or is not Christian or religious? From this vantage point, starting with bodies, I would like to suggest that Glenn Beck, Senator John Danforth, and Barack Obama stand together. They respect bodies. In Faith and Politics, Senator Danforth expressed profound frustration with the use of Terri Schiavo, the Florida woman who remained hospitalized in a vegetative state for 15 years to make political hay. Danforth's concern was for the sanctity of her body and the well-being of the bodies around her, family members, friends, doctors. Danforth was not interested, in this case, with the body politic that was the Republican Party. Glenn Beck, he cherishes the Founding Fathers, like George Washington, in part because he sees Washington as a defender of Jewish Americans and their right to their religious freedom, and that defending their religion is also about defending their bodies to practice that religion. Finally, it's clear that bodies loom large in Barack Obama's political, religious, and personal imagination. His father's absent body, the bodies of dead children, of abortion protesters, the bodies of religious communities. They animate the audacity of hope and other key Obama writings and speeches. Obama, Danforth, and Beck, they disagree profoundly on the abstract notion of whether the nation is religious or Christian or what that even means. But where they agree, where we could begin, and what we may take from the petitions of the 1770s, it's not just that everybody has a body, to invoke Martin Luther King Jr., but it's that everybody is part of and connected to other bodies. When we think of bodies second and abstracted ideologies first, we run the risk of putting intangibles before tangibles, non-existence before existence. That was a problem these Massachusetts petitioners, their families, and their friends, they knew all too well. It may be a struggle to see bodies before ballots, to see bodies before budgets, to see bodies before beliefs. What these forgotten founders of the 1770s, they called their struggle a glorious struggle. It was one that valued and needed every body. Thank you for the time. Thank you for your time listening to this body and my connections to lots of bodies here and elsewhere. Thank you.
Good morning. Is that good? Yes. Until very recently, I lived in Houston, Texas, and this is my first trip back in over a year, so it's good to be back home. There are approximately 3 million Muslims in the United States, a somewhat controversial and unofficial estimate, since the U.S. Census does not count the population by religious affiliation. American Muslims, like every other religious group in the country, are a diverse group. They follow a variety of Islamic traditions. They are Sunni, Shia, Ismaili, Ahmadi, or they follow homegrown American Islams, such as the Nation of Islam. American Muslims are also racially and ethnically diverse. They are African American, of South Asian, Southeast Asian, Arab, and West African descent, and an increasing number of American Muslims identify as Latino or white. Until September 11, 2001, American Muslims lived in relative obscurity, largely escaping notice from historians, sociologists, and policymakers. The advent of the War on Terror catapulted American Muslims into the public eye. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 further spurred interest in and the notoriety of American Muslims. Obama's middle name, Hussein, his Kenyan father, and his childhood spent partly in the majority Muslim nation of Indonesia fueled speculation that Obama himself was a secret Muslim. Despite the long history of Islam in the United States, and despite the enormous diversity of Islamic beliefs and practices in this country, both 9/11 and Obama's election have proved to be focal points for often vicious critiques of Islam. Islam and Christianity arrived on the North American continent at the same time. Christopher Columbus's crew included conversos, that is, Muslims and Jews who had been coerced into converting to Christianity. Early in the 16th century, enslaved Muslims accompanied conquistadors in their entradas. Estebanico was an enslaved North African from Azamor in Morocco who accompanied Panfilo de Narvaez's entrada into Florida. Estebanico's captors might not have thought of him as Muslim and likely forced him to convert to Christianity after his capture, when he would have acquired his new name, which is Stephen in English. Between 1527 and 1536, Estebanico and 3 other Spanish survivors of Narvaez's expedition walked from present-day Texas, from Galveston actually, to the Pacific coast of Mexico. Estebanico was no stranger to cultural fluidity. His remarkable linguistic abilities helped pilot the survivors of Narvaez's expedition across North America. In 1539, Estebanico accompanied another entrada into the American Southwest, using his knowledge of native cultures, languages, and diplomatic customs to help guide Spanish conquistadores. He was killed near Sonora in 1540. Did Estebanico identify as Muslim? It's a question that is impossible to answer, but Spanish officials were suspicious of Muslim converts to Christianity, forced or otherwise. Technically, the New World was off-limit to conversos, who were barred from making the journey. Yet Estebanico's presence in the Americas suggests that this was a rule honored in the breach. The Spanish continued to use enslaved African Muslims as key parts of their colonization schemes. The settlement at St. Augustine contained many enslaved Muslims in the late 16th century. In other words, there were enslaved Muslims in North America long before permanent English settlement began at Jamestown in 1607. Most Muslims who came to the Americas before 1850 arrived as Estebanico did, as enslaved people mostly from West and West Central Africa, but also occasionally from North Africa. Most historians have not attempted to come up with a demographic analysis, though Sylviane Diouf thought, reasonably, that of the 12.5 million enslaved people brought to the Americas from West Africa, at least several hundred thousand were likely Muslim. Many enslaved people arriving in North America would have been familiar with Islam, even if they did not identify as Muslims themselves. Michael Gomez has noted that around 50% of enslaved people coming to mainland North America came from those areas of West Africa where Islam was either state-sponsored or associated with a culturally significant minority, reflecting the cosmopolitan religious lives of West Africans who combined Christianity, Islam, and traditional West African practice in novel syncretic ways. The general problem is that enslaved Muslims were even a more invisible minority within the invisible institution of slave religion. As Edward Curtis has noted, quote, "When whites observed African American Muslim rituals, they often did not understand what was taking place right in front of their eyes." Nevertheless, Sylviane Diouf has pressed historians to recognize that enslaved Muslims were everywhere, and that, quote, "Islam was indeed a diasporic religion." Though the lives of enslaved Muslims remain opaque, scholars know a great deal about a few specific individuals. In 1788, soldiers from another ethnic group captured Abd al-Rahman Ibrahima and sold him to European slave traders. Abd al-Rahman lived as an enslaved man in New Orleans for decades, marrying an African-American Baptist woman named Isabella, before writing a letter in Arabic in 1826 asking for his freedom. Abd al-Rahman toured the United States, raising money to buy freedom for himself and his children. Newspapers around the country chronicled his travels and his life story. Colonization enthusiasts, that is, white Americans who wanted to emancipate black people and repatriate them to West Africa. Colonization enthusiasts hoped that Abd al-Rahman, who was celebrated as, quote, "a Moorish prince," would aid them in establishing diplomatic ties between the infant colony of freed people in Liberia and nearby African kingdoms, as well as helping convert West Africans to Christianity. In 1829, he journeyed to Liberia with his wife, though he was unable to fulfill the hopes of his captors and sponsors in the United States. He died shortly after his arrival there. We know about Abd al-Rahman in part because he was literate and also was able to advocate for himself and his family, using American ideas about Islam and Muslims to get what he wanted. Most enslaved Muslims were not so lucky. Similarly, Yarrow Mahmoud, an educated West African who was enslaved in 1752, gained his freedom after 45 years as a slave to a Maryland family. He moved to Washington, D.C., where he owned property until his death in 1823. And interestingly, there's some archaeological investigation going on at that property in DC now. Yarrow and Abd al-Rahman had compelling biographies that often stand in for the stories of enslaved Muslims. But the fact remains that most enslaved Muslims were either not literate or did not otherwise have the means to make their stories known. Most enslaved Muslims worked to keep their faith intact, even in the face of persecution, passing on their names, rituals, including prayer mats and beads, and prayers to their descendants. Retaining Islam as enslaved people in a new world was a form of resistance and of self-preservation. While the biographies of individuals like Abd al-Rahman and Yarrow Mahmud suggest how enslaved Muslims lived, the devotion of most of these people went unrecognized and unremembered by the Americans who owned them. The numbers of enslaved Muslims in the United States probably rose in the last decade before the close of the transatlantic slave trade. The Sudanese Jihad, which swept across Africa in a wide belt from east to west, caught many African Muslims in its net who were enslaved and shipped to the United States, which had drastically increased importations of enslaved people in anticipation of the closing of the trade in 1808. Sometimes these enslaved Muslims were even apparent to otherwise blind white Americans. Writing in 1842, Presbyterian clergyman Charles Colcock Jones noted that, quote, "The Mohammedan Africans remaining of the old stock of importations, although accustomed to hear the gospel preached, have been known to accommodate Christianity to Mohammedanism. God, they say, is Allah, and Jesus Christ is Muhammad. Their religion is the same, but different countries have different names." Jones's observations signal, I think, some discomfort with African American spirituality. Despite the visibility of African Muslims such as Abd al-Rahman and Yarrow Mahmud, most enslaved Muslims remained invisible to their captors. This, I think, was the beginning of an erasure. The presence of enslaved Muslims was opaque to their captors and thus remains largely opaque to historians. Refusal to recognize this part of the African Muslim past contributes to an ideology in which Islam is foreign to the United States. If Americans did not learn about Islam from their enslaved property, they did learn about it through other means. European Christians and North African and Ottoman Muslims came into extended contact with one another in the context of warfare, violence, piracy, enslavement, and travel. The English privateer and adventurer Francis Drake carried some enslaved Turks away with him after his siege of Cartagena de Indias in 1586. Turk, we should understand here, was an all-purpose English descriptor of any Muslim person from North Africa or the Ottoman East. It was a very broad descriptor and doesn't necessarily mean somebody from present-day Turkey. One of these men, a Turk named Chinano, converted to Christianity before the English sent him back to Constantinople, where they hoped that he would facilitate any number of conversions from Islam to Christianity. Their hopes were unfounded. Englishmen saw Islam as a threat and as a competitor for one simple reason. English sailors, merchants, mercenaries, and travelers in the Mediterranean were under constant risk of being captured, enslaved, and converted to Islam. An estimated 1 million Europeans were enslaved between 1400 and 1800 in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, and some of these people, mostly men, converted to Islam in order to gain their freedom. Others hoped that relatives would ransom them. They wrote letters to family and charitable organizations in England, often at the insistence of their owners, in hopes of redemption. North African piracy threatened American shores as well. In 1690, Virginia resident Daniel Tyler was reported, quote, "unhappily taken by the Turks and carried to Algiers, and hath not for at least 7 years past been heard of, so that he is esteemed dead." And this was an action to allow his widow to probate his estate and then remarry. The famous English mercenary and adventurer John Smith fought the Ottomans in Eastern Europe in the early 17th century and was taken as a prisoner of war and enslaved at the Battle of Rotentan in 1602. Smith reported that his master ordered other slaves to, quote, "strip him naked and shave his head and beard as bare as his hand. A great ring of iron with a long stalk bowed like a sickle was riveted round his neck." Smith famously wrote in the third person. Eventually, Smith escaped after he, quote, "beat out his master's brains with a threshing bat." Despite this experience, Smith had little to say specifically about Islam or Muslims. After his escape, Smith traveled extensively as a free man throughout the North African states, observing the wealth and power of these princely states and noting that the, quote, countries of Fez and Morocco are the best part of all Barbary, abounding with people, they eat well and have all good necessities for man's use. William Strachey, another Virginia colonist, drew on his experience as a clerk for the Levant Company in Constantinople to draw comparisons between Ottoman Muslims and native North Americans. Some of Strachey's observations were relatively neutral. He noted, quote, the Indians' drink is, as the Turks, clear water, and, quote, the Indians spread a mat, as the Turks do a carpet, for them to sit upon. Strachey's comparisons were less sanguine when discussing Indians' marital habits. Strachey wrote that Wahunsonacock, the paramount chief of Tidewater, Virginia, we know him as Powhatan, followed a polygamous practice, but did not keep all of his wives, quote, as the Turk in one seraglio or house. He also theorized that these, quote, sensual helps, as the Turks, weakened the Indian's body politic. Strachey used other comparisons as well, describing a game young Indian boys played as similar to one described in Virgil. So Islam was more than merely another point of reference for him. Strachey's experience of Islam in the Ottoman Empire was both an idiom for comprehending the strangeness and foreignness of native people, as well as a way of expressing disdain for native customs that the English knew primarily from Muslim countries, such as polygamy. Islam operated in English discourses about the New World generally as a point of negative comparison. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, the Islamic world occupied a key place in Anglo-American polemics against political tyranny, seemingly senseless violence, slavery, and other questionable practices. Timothy Marr has called this rhetorical practice, evidenced both in Smith's and Strachey's writings, Islamicism. That is, an Orientalism that both described the, quote, untractable difference of Islam while simultaneously upholding Anglo-American identity. The identification of political violence and tyranny with Islamic practice generally and Muslim peoples in particular is thus a centuries-long rhetorical tradition. To call a political opponent Turkish was to intimate both tyranny and senseless violence. Likewise, in the late 18th and 19th centuries, American ideas about Islam became important with the emergence of the Latter-day Saints, who for some decades allowed polygamous marriages. Americans opposed to Mormonism likened the Latter-day Saints Church to Islam and Joseph Smith to Muhammad. These commenters linked a vision of politically tyrannical Islam to an emergent idea of Islam that was also tyrannical in the home, especially to women. Wrote one commentator, quote, Turkey is in our midst. Modern Mohammedism has its Mecca at Salt Lake, where the prophet speaks of his wives as cows. Clearly, the Quran was Joseph Smith's model so closely followed as to exclude even the poor pretension of originality in his foul revelations. And there are many, many, many other commentators who are writing similar things, linking the emerging religion of the Latter-day Saints with what Americans thought Islam to be. The idea that Islam, and by extension Mormonism's devalued women, reverberates even into contemporary discourses about the Islamic world and the place of women in it. Both the conservative Christian evangelist Franklin Graham and liberal political commentator Bill Maher have used American notions about the status of women in majority Muslim countries to fuel Islamophobic rhetoric. And I can talk more about this in the Q&A. This is the part that I had to cut to stay close to the 15-minute mark. American Islamicism was thus a complicated interplay of actual human experiences of the Muslim other, accompanied by rumor, stereotypes, and the ever-present threat of violence. While Americans had difficulty seeing enslaved Muslims in their midst, they had and continue to have no such trouble understanding Islam as inherently tyrannical and misogynistic. Titling this talk, Barack Hussein Obama, America's first Muslim president, plays in a satirical way on the ways in which Americans doubt the president's religious affiliation and used his supposed Muslimness to demonstrate his un-Americanness. Barack Obama thus became, however unwittingly, a focal point of Islamophobic commentary in the United States. This is a discourse that denies the actual existence and complex histories of American Muslims, but engages long-standing Islamicist discourses that originated in the 15th and 16th centuries. This kind of rhetoric has a long history, and as we have seen, it has also had the effect of marginalizing and othering American Muslims. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, judging by the election a few days ago, this is quite a good topic. How could an administration that began with such promise with regard to the sheer amount of support it received from Latinos end so badly? How could one of the Latinos' key issues promised to them as a first-term agenda item be tucked away till the second term, and amidst the congressional intransigence and the fervent opposition of the Tea Party simply be allowed to die? What made President Obama think he could possibly pass any legislation this time? Well, luckily, we do not have to weigh in on that questionable political strategy that relegated immigration reform to the second term. Perhaps a more intriguing question is why Latinos support President Obama at all. Some wondered why, after failed legislative battles over immigration and over the continued support for deportations that averaged 400,000 a year since 2008, with the continued militarization of the border, and in 2011, more than $18 billion for more border agents, drones, stations, why do Latinos continue to vote for Obama? And why did representatives of key religious groups support Obama's immigration efforts, and at the same time not support him? So clearly there's a disjuncture between Obama's actions and his reliance on Latinos as a significant part of his re-election coalition. The question here is to the extent that any religious organization can influence the way Latinos vote, which is still questionable. The three religious organizations that I want to examine here, the Roman Catholic Church, Latino Protestants, kind of a catch-all phrase, and the Latter-day Saints, all lobbied in one way or another for immigration reform. The LDS Church did so on a regional level in Utah. The United Methodists and Latino evangelicals lobbied on behalf of the repeal of the Alabama law, HB 56. And Latino evangelical activities also focused on local and national levels to try and move the needle towards getting their white brethren to support immigration reform. So before examining these cases, just brief history. Because the problem with immigration reform, there's many, but one of them is when you try to move the debate away from the rule of law narrative, which in that case, immigration reform almost never wins. To focus on compassion and mercy, you might want to offer some historical context, at least that's what I want to do, because this is how Latinos find themselves in this place, right? Because what I'm going to argue is that it is the intractable mythic narrative of immigration fused together with another kind of mythic narrative about the infallibility of the rule of law. That is what eventually wins out, despite religious organizations' best efforts. Latino Catholics, mainline Protestants, and evangelicals, and Latter-day Saints all had vested interest in passing immigration reform. They simply were incapable of overcoming this narrative that has comprised the history of Latino immigration for centuries. Tropes about the rule of law and the triumph of civil religion over compassionate Christian witness to the stranger won out. These religious activists attempted to create alternative mythic representations of Latino immigration by stressing the virtuous, hardworking narratives of immigrants' past, the sanctity of the family, and how immigration, itself a mythic narrative, acts as a standalone monolith for how this country has been built. All were interweaved by these activists into impassioned pleas to treat Latino immigrants humanely and with dignity. What these groups did not take into consideration, or if they did not fully reconcile the need that the dominant culture and its political surrogate in the Republican Party has in securing their own mythic narrative. The GOP today is essentially a party anchored by older whites, Catholics, evangelicals, Mormons, and others, grassroots voters, not their leaders in terms of these religious groups, These religious leaders are viewed as elites and activists out of touch with the common people. These grassroots voters, they're the ones who vote. The struggle for the mythic immigrant narrative and the rule of law begins in the colonies of the Atlantic seaboard and the founding documents of this nation. It ignores the Latin American roots of this nation, which have been around longer than Jamestown. This mythology, rooted firmly in what Eric McDaniel calls Christian nationalism, what others view to some varying degree as civil religion, is used rather effectively to preserve a sense of American difference and diminishes the historic role of Latino and Latina immigrants in building this country. Latinos have never been viewed as sufficiently American enough. So to fill that vacuum, narratives of illegality, criminality, contagion, all slowly lead to the erosion of the rule of law in this alternative immigration narrative. It is this fear that the American way of life is being upended. The rule of law trope is a signifying order. It orders fairness and justice, and it leads to the idea that to be American means to be law-abiding. Since many undocumented persons are technically breaking the law, it is questionable whether Latinos can ever be good Americans. Briefly, the history of Mexican immigration to the United States after 1848 becomes much more complicated when crossing the border becomes an illegal act in 1929. For most of the 20th century, the history is one of mass deportations and detention, mostly Mexican and Mexican-American, to Mexico, usually occurring when economic pressures dictated the precious resources of local, state, and federal governments should have only been used to support Americans. The first such deportation starts in the 1930s, where nearly 500,000 Mexicans and Mexican-American citizens, by the way, are sent back to Mexico. The next deportation occurs in the 1950s, called Operation Wetback, not my word, where over 1 million people were sent back to Mexico. Today's deportations, nearly 400,000 every year since 2008, like the 30s, like the 50s, begin in earnest with economic downturns. So, these narratives, interwoven with the idea of contagion and criminality, have fueled the ugly specter of something that happened just recently, these clashes in Murrieta, California, and elsewhere, where anti-immigrant protesters have carried signs alleging that the women and the children in those buses were carrying diseases and that they were secretly harboring gang members. These narratives and others challenge the dominant culture's ability to determine the American mythic representation of an era, somewhere in the distant past, that was free of criminal trespassers who trampled on the rule of law. Sensing a loss of the much cherished and much misused trope of the rule of law were what Tea Party activists used to counter the lobbying efforts of Catholic, Protestant, and LDS leaders, who, for their own reasons, decided that it was time to push once again for immigration reform right in the middle of another and seemingly endless cycles of xenophobia. Latino Mormons. Probably no other internal debate about immigration demonstrates these clashes more clearly than the tensions that arose within the Mormon Church over a specific tenet of the Mormon faith called Article 12. One article that I found, which is interesting, in the ironically named Center for Immigrant Rights, a group with very little interest in immigrant rights, but as self-identified. An LDS member and former Foreign Service officer, Ronald Mortensen, took to task the influence of the LDS hierarchy in passing what he viewed as an amnesty bill in 2011 in Utah. Mortensen quotes church doctrine, the 12th Article of Faith, which pledges that LDS members will be subjects to, quote, kings, presidents, rulers, magistrates, in obeying and honoring and sustaining the law. With the LDS emphasis on the rule of law, and as Mortensen notes, the LDS tradition holds that America is a divine nation. He laments the loss of this emphasis on law and, in effect, the loss of his imagined America. Quote, they openly taught that the Founding Fathers were guided by the hand of God and that the U.S. Constitution was divinely inspired and that the U.S. was chosen land for the restoration of Christ's true church. Particularly problematic for Mortensen and for other LDS members was that the appalling reality that the church was allowing illegal aliens to be baptized, to accept temple recommends, and to serve in important church positions. Mortensen lays blame on the church, who refused to acknowledge that they even had an immigration reform policy. Mormons are left to try to discern what this change means for the gospel as they have known it, he laments. Morton's case study, as it were, was where the bill was recognizing certain rights for undocumented people in Utah, mostly the driver's license issues, and how the LDS hierarchy worked behind the scenes to secure the passage of that bill. Mortensen then goes on to identify how the LDS's call for compassion for the undocumented has shifted his own narrative, his own church's narrative, towards a social justice agenda. The loss of the rule of law demonstrates how far the LDS church has, quote, moved from its American roots. The agenda now seems to be wholly guided by trying to patronize the LDS's large Latino constituency. As the church found it more difficult to gain converts among American citizens, LDS officials increasingly focused the church's missionary activity on illegal immigrant community. Latino Protestants, both mainline and evangelicals, tried to upend the Alabama HB 56 law. I think what happened with them is pretty much the same thing that happened with Catholics, is that they simply failed to see this grand narrative taking place. Both organizations, the United Methodist, Episcopal, and two groups that represent Latino evangelicals, the National Latino Evangelical Coalition and the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, both organizations badly misjudged the extent to which the Tea Party controls much of the agenda of the Republican Party. And they did not contextualize their cause. That is stated even in their literature, that they failed to convince these Alabama pastors, so they went down and visited them, that this was an issue that should bring them together in terms of lobbying efforts, in terms of writing letters, in terms of doing that kind of grassroots work, and that they fail miserably to contextualize what immigration actually means. And if they had done that, they might have known that the desires for humane treatment and compassion are admirable, but only when the narrative of desirable immigration supports this imagined America. Latinos historically and today cannot fill that narrative, and calls to the goodness of people's better natures have not secured reform and rights for marginalized groups in this country without some hint that those who do not support those reforms are going to pay, either economically through boycotts or politically through being voted out of office. That simply didn't work. Okay? Moving on to the Catholics. What Catholics and LDS and Latino Protestants of all stripes understand is they can count. And they can count how many Latinos are in their churches. And they can count and they can understand of this trope of demography as destiny is actually coming to pass. And I think that's part of the reason why the Roman Catholic Church historically have been very supportive of immigration reform, again, tried to make its presence known in a very strong way in this debate. So what I did is I took a quick perusal through the National Catholic Reporter over the last few years to find that Catholics from grassroots parishioners to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops were involved in immigration debates in one way or another for years. For the grassroots, though, there were lots of stories about parishes in transition and how some of those went well, the loss of the old European immigrant, now making this uneasy transition to Latino parishes. There was a few of those stories where it was successful and they did not lament the loss of their America. And there were others where rather than hand the parish over to be shared, they just left. So, what can you say? What seems to be this really interesting New York Times article made mention of the fact that this was happening throughout the corridor, mostly of the Midwest through Highway 35. And they suggested that people are kind of getting worn down by the issue, that they're just tired of immigration reform and of immigrants in particular, and they have resigned themselves to the fact that immigrants are here and they're not leaving. Because you are going to see a bit more moving of that needle towards reform for driver's licenses, reform for insurance, for work laws, things of that nature. Now, what these stories do suggest is that when working at a grassroots level, Catholics will act on their own to implement church teachings regarding the treatment of the undocumented. It will not happen every time, and certainly there are failures, but the Catholic media promoted this idea that the church is a welcoming and open place for immigrants. Okay? So in this local setting, the Catholic Church looks compassionate. The stories of women singing to these young children for this undocumented minor crisis that happened over the summer, it gives a very personal level to the idea that you're helping the stranger, the alien, and it lends, the religious sensibilities can be most readily felt on a personal level. So the Catholic bishops and other concerned Catholic clerical organizations are nearly uniformly for immigrant reform and lobbied extensively for it, but it still failed. And there may be one of many reasons why it fails, is that the most prominent Catholic politicians in Congress, Speaker Boehner and Paul Ryan, at least for one, have done little to further the interest in immigration reform. Let me conclude. Journalist Jacob Lupfer, I think, had a really good piece that autopsies the failure of immigration reform and why even conservative evangelical support leaders like Joel Hunter, Rick Warren, were incapable of moving the House GOP to action because immigration reform for white evangelicals is not a salient issue. Like the GOP, white evangelicals are largely walled off from immigrants in a kind of religious gerrymandering, where white evangelicals find themselves in churches in the suburbs and not in the neighborhoods populated by immigrants. Like the gerrymandered districts of the GOP, white evangelicals do not view immigration reform as important as any one of a number of other cultural war issues. What are people listening to then? What are people listening to? They're listening to people like this Tea Party writer and activist Diana West, who's laying the groundwork for the conspiracy involving the Department of Homeland Security, which, according to West, planned for the reception of these unaccompanied minors, 65,000 of them, with an eye towards their eventual resettlement by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. She repeats the claim that these children are gangbangers and drug runners, that they are crashing our borders. She continues, quote, "This explains why the bureaucracy acts to smash the culture of a cowtown and rural communities by dropping blocks of unassimilable, primitive, hostile aliens in their midst, all in the name of compassion, just not for Americans." She asked her readers to look at a blog entitled Refugee Resettlement Watch, run by Ann Cochran, who tracks the resettlement of refugees such as the unaccompanied minors done under the auspices of dozens of religious organizations, Catholic Charities, United Methodist Refugee Services, where she views are on this grand conspiracy to bring in quote-unquote jihadists and drug cartels and infiltrate the country. From this, one can see that despite their good intentions, religious groups were doomed from the start because the very contextualized approach that many did want but didn't get is not something that's talked about in these churches. Failing to see the historical trajectory of Latino immigrants cast as a perpetually criminal class of unassimilable foreigners, the LDS Church, Latino Protestants, and Catholic leaders may have done well to lead their congregations into actions, like the Catholic bishops, who this past spring held Mass across the border, symbolically offering communion to Mexican and Mexican-American alike, and crossing the border themselves to listen to their stories. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank all my fellow panelists up here, and in the previous session, I've got light bulbs going off in my head, all these great ideas popping in. I want to redo my paper, but I'm not going to. My name's Kevin Schultz. I'm lucky enough to teach at University of Illinois at Chicago, and the title of my paper is The Blessings of American Religious Pluralism. When, on August 6, 2009, the U.S. Senate voted to confirm Sonia Sotomayor's nomination to fill David Souter's seat on the U.S. Supreme Court, hardly anyone thought it worthwhile to mention her faith. The newspapers and television reporters talked a great deal about the fact that she was the first Latino ever nominated to the court, or that she seemed to be the living embodiment of whatever was left of the American dream, having raised herself up from a relatively impoverished childhood in the Bronx housing projects to rack up an unbelievably distinguished career in the world of law. And even those who opposed her nomination, for example, 31 of the then 40 Republicans in the Senate, didn't bother to mention her faith at all, choosing instead to criticize her for being an activist judge. But hardly anyone pointed out that once she was sworn in 2 days later, she would become the 6th Catholic then sitting on the bench, not only giving Catholics a supermajority on the country's highest court, but also, and this is what I find most striking, taking the spot of the last remaining Protestant. Once she was sworn in, all the non-Catholics on the bench were Jews. But nothing was really said about this. It wasn't a big deal, evidently. Of the supermajority of Catholics on the court, for instance, the bombastic and militantly watchful Catholic conservative Bill Donahue said, "Barely a peep was made." And of the fact that for the first time in American history, not a single Protestant sat among the constituents of one of the three branches of the American government, hardly anyone seemed to notice at all. Now, my theme today is this. Among the many transformations that happened in the age of Obama, and despite the bombast and rhetoric coming from the religious right, surely one of the most vital themes has to be the almost casual way in which the country has come to accept religious pluralism. And by saying this, I'm arguing against everybody else who's spoken so far. So this is great. This will be combat time. Evidence for this is everywhere. Religious discrimination is down in the United States, even it has risen sharply in other countries throughout the world. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, reported a sharp rise in claims of religious discrimination during the George W. Bush years right after 9/11, before noting a gentle decline starting in 2009. And in addition to this, and this is of equal importance, I think, a large percentage of the EEOC's claims were found to lack merit, which suggests that there's more fear than there is bona fide abuse. And perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence for the lack of interfaith strife in our days comes from the fact that the loudest claims of religious discrimination these days have come from some of the largest, most powerful religious groups in the country, including evangelical Protestants and, of course, the group with that supermajority on the Supreme Court, American Catholics. And what have they been complaining about? Not that they themselves have been prevented from worshiping as they see fit, nor that they've been persecuted for believing what they believe. But rather than in America's quest to honor its minority faiths, the country has curtailed the rights of large groups from imposing its beliefs onto others. No Catholic, for instance, was ever forced to practice contraception under President Obama's Affordable Care Act, but some Catholic employers were asked to contribute to the contraceptive efforts of employees who might. No Protestant, meanwhile, has ever been asked to denounce their own faith, just to honor the right of others to practice theirs. Historically speaking, compared to past eras of religious discrimination, including burning of churches, denying of employment, forcing certain people to live in certain neighborhoods depending on what their religious beliefs were, this is an era marked not by heavy brutalities based on discrimination, at least religious discrimination. Now, perhaps surprisingly, at least I was surprised, this general acceptance of America's religious pluralism is more ideological than demographic. That is to say, in this case, it's the ideas that matter and not the numbers. And what I mean by that is there hasn't been any significant uptick in the number of religious minorities in the United States. And when one actually looks at the numbers, it's clear that the United States, demographically speaking, is still a profoundly Christian nation. That is to say, somewhere in the range of 76 to 78% of Americans all claim to be either Protestant or Catholic. And breaking this down even further, it's about 50% of Americans claim to be Protestant and 25% claim to be Catholic, more or less. So among the nations of the world, the United States isn't that religiously diverse. And I'm not making it up. A Pew study from 2012 ranks the United States as the 68th most religiously diverse nation in the world, more diverse than, say, Iran or Afghanistan, but far less diverse than Vietnam or Nigeria or Suriname or New Zealand, for instance. Now, some might say that the preponderance of American religious diversity, our celebration of our religious diversity, lies not in how we rank in majority versus minority numbers, but instead in the vast diversity that we have among the non-Christians. And on the one hand, there is some truth to that. In our country, you can find almost any stripe of faith if you go looking for it. But on the other hand, this sort of acceptance must be viewed with great caution. Consider, for example, that the vast majority of America's non-Christian population, the sort of 25% that are non-Christian, the vast majority of those claim to have no religion at all, a group that's rapidly approaching 20% of all Americans. And we're going to hear about this later from Professor Hedstrom. While all the other religious minorities put together Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and on and on and on. When you put them all together, they total just 5.3% of the population. So if almost every faith in the world can be found somewhere in the United States, America can still make little claim to being among the most religiously diverse nations in the world. Indeed, it's 68th, right? So instead, what's changed during the first years of the 21st century is that Americans have become far more accepting of religious traditions that are not their own, including, and I find profoundly, towards people who claim no religion at all. So if America is not terribly diverse, it is nonetheless increasingly accepting of the idea of religious pluralism. So, as historians, we all care about where these ideas come from, and this idea of America's religious pluralism has a long history. There were some iterations of it in the early instances of American history, all the way back to the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649, to Thomas Jefferson's Statute on Religious Freedom of 1777, to James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments of 1785, to, of course, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. But throughout the 19th century, the United States was largely controlled by what historian David Sihat has called a moral establishment that made Protestantism the legally regulated region of the land. People could be cited for blasphemy even if the states had no blasphemy laws. The moral codes of Protestantism were somewhat non-litigiously accepted as common law. And even though there were constitutional protections against establishing any religion as the law of the land, Sihat argues quite convincingly for me that the Protestant majority could affect its will through the courts and through the culture. Now, the first instances of this idea of America's religious pluralism take place in the first decades of the 20th century, when large waves of European immigration take a distinctly Catholic and Jewish cast, and the massive industrialization that was going on at the time created scads of urban plight. Protestants fashioned what came to be called the social gospel movement, which was to meet the needs of the people at the time. And much to their surprise, somewhat shockingly, they found on those mean urban streets Catholic and Jewish groups doing much of the same work. So they decided that it made sense to work together. So the first instances of working together take place in the fields of civic welfare, of filling sandbags during floods or feeding hungry in times of economic recession. There's no need to overlap there. Let's work together. And these initial interfaith activities bled into some of the first conversations of religious goodwill. Many began to actually ponder, write down these thoughts even, which is great for us historians, the idea that maybe America couldn't just consider itself a Protestant nation any longer. After World War II, these conversations pick up, and I'd like to say it's because everybody, had a feel-good moment, but instead it was in reaction to the rise of open nativism that happened throughout the United States in the immediate post-World War I years, when anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and racist ideas really continue to take the hold in American life. This is, of course, when the Ku Klux Klan has its most dramatic revival, when Woodrow Wilson is very busy segregating Washington, D.C., and of course, the ultimate achievement of the nativists in this 1920s era was the spearheading the drive to end widespread immigration, which culminates in the landmark Immigration Restriction Acts of 1924 and then the even worse ones of 1929. So in response to this nativism, several movements rise up to push back. And among the most successful, and I actually think the most successful of these movements, is what's called the Goodwill Movement for Religious Tolerance in America. Led by liberal Protestants working together with Catholics and Jews, a number of organizations start popping up in the 1920s. And the most successful of the bunch was the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And their whole goal, and this is so vitally important to remember, their whole goal is to reimagine what the United States was, to pull it away from a vision of America that's centered on white Protestant nativism and focus it more fully on a general acceptance of the idea of pluralism, and especially religious pluralism. America could, they argued, honor the sort of time-tested ideals of equality and liberty, no matter which faith you got there by. And these organizations did some really crazy, foolish things that are kind of fun for us to find in the archives. They sent a rabbi, a priest, and a minister into small towns across the country where they'd never seen a rabbi or a priest, and they would do a sort of onstage shtick to dispel the myths about these minority faiths. They also did media campaigns. They wrote newspaper editorials all the time, and they even went on to found the Religious News Service, which is still active today. But their biggest victory comes during World War II. No surprise, with an enemy like Hitler, the National Conference of Christians and Jews doesn't have to resort to the saccharine to make its point. For instance, the NCCJ was, and in making these arguments that we no longer can be seen as a Protestant nation, because that's what Hitler looks like, the NCCJ and these other goodwill organizations were wildly successful during the Second World War. For instance, the NCCJ was one of 2 non-military groups admitted onto every military base in the country and in the world, the other being the Red Cross, right? They actively aided the chaplaincy corps, they provided literature to soldiers, and even in my favorite instance, they provided little sort of business card-sized prayer cards that they would give to each soldier in case your comrade happened to be dying and he was of a different faith. So on one side was the Protestant, and then on the back side were Catholic and Jewish prayers to say before your friend expires. After the war, Catholics and Jews now having a taste of equal place at the table, they didn't want to let go. And so they didn't. In schools, in city halls, in social fraternities, in colleges, in nearly all aspects of American life, throughout the 1950s, groups of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews articulated and fought for an acceptance of America's religious pluralism. Fraternities had to change their charters, for instance. Creches could no longer appear on City Hall at Christmas time unless some sort of modification was made. We should either get rid of the creche or we should invite all faiths to celebrate on City Hall. And in the early 1960s, the court responded to this pluralistic vision of America with 2 banner court cases that outlawed forced prayer and Bible readings in the public schools. And while this can be interpreted in numerous ways, the overriding stories of these cases is the court's declaration that the United States government should not prioritize one faith over any other, and it should allow them free rein to practice as they see fit. There's open contestation of those words, but pluralism had arrived. Now, that this open declaration of America's religious pluralism happens before 1965 is incredibly important, because it was in 1965 that LBJ, President Johnson, ushered in immigration reform, which, to nearly everyone's surprise who voted for the bill, actually allowed large numbers of people from Africa, from Asia, and Latin America to come to the United States, bringing with them their faith, of course. In came Sikhs, in came large numbers of Muslims, Jains, Hindus, Confucians, and more. And hardly any of them, when they came, were persecuted for their faith. This is the kind of acceptance that's celebrated by Diana Eck's Banner 2001 book, which is called The New Religious America. The country, she argued, had gone from a Protestant nation in the first years of the 20th century to a tri-faith nation in the middle decades of the century to a wildly diverse nation by the end of the 20th century. And although Eck warned of potential confrontations, the book is mostly a celebration. American diversity had come. Except, of course, as I told you earlier, it hadn't. The numbers just don't hold up to this argument. Less than 6% of all Americans are of a faith that is not Protestant, Catholic, or nothing, right? But what has won is this idea of America's religious pluralism. Now, although he's operated in a subordinate role to greater social trends, for his part, President Obama has played a role in this almost casual acceptance of America's religious pluralism. In his inaugural address from 2009, of course, which is literally minutes into his tenure as president, Obama becomes the first president to acknowledge a wide swath of faiths, including even the nuns, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, the nuns, people with no faith, as important constituents in the American project. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers, he said, before going on to honor the idea of our religious pluralism. We are shaped by every language and culture drawn from every end of this earth. And because we have tasted the bitter swill of civil war and segregation and emerged from that dark chapter stronger and more united, we cannot help but believe that the old hatreds shall someday pass, that the lines of tribe shall soon dissolve, that as the world grows smaller, our common humanity shall reveal itself. In addition to the stirring rhetoric, he has what I call the Martin Luther King problem, which is once you start quoting him, it's very hard to know where to stop. But in addition to the soaring rhetoric, Obama also immediately, and this is within a week of becoming president, recrafted President George W. Bush's Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, which Bush had designed to funnel money to religious organizations that were providing social services to the hungry or the poor, but which quickly came under attack for a way for President Bush to funnel money to his friends in the religious right. When Obama comes into office in 2009, one of his very first acts was to broaden the number of recipients, as well as establish an expansive advisory council to ensure that there's no favoritism at play. Income Muslim groups, income Hindu groups, income Sikh groups to serve on this advisory council. But nowhere has this understanding of American pluralism shaped Obama's presidency more than in his dealings with predominantly Muslim countries. A few months after he was inaugurated, Obama sought to reconcile relations with certain Middle Eastern countries, most especially Turkey, which was then applying for membership in the European Union. At a joint press conference with the president of Turkey, Obama reflected on some of the similarities between the two nations, specifically citing a common, if contested, tradition of religious pluralism. Although he said, and you've heard this before from Professor Blum, although he said, speaking of the United States, we have a very large Christian population, we do not consider ourselves a Christian nation or a Jewish nation or a Muslim nation. But what Professor Blum left out was the last line, which is this affirmation of America's religious pluralism. We consider ourselves a nation of citizens who are bound by ideals and a set of values. Closer to home, and this is my concluding point, Obama endorsed religious pluralism once again in 2010, when he supported the right of New York's Muslim community to build an Islamic community center 2 blocks from the site of the recently destroyed World Trade Center. As a citizen and as a president, I believe that Muslims have the same right to practice their religion as anyone else in the country, he said, affirming American religious pluralism. This is America, and our commitment to religious freedom must be unshakable. So diverse or not, American pluralism has in fact triumphed in the age of Obama. And as with so much else, President Obama has grasped onto that history, not as a leader, but in an effort to continue its success. So despite all the clamorings from the religious right, a movement designed, I might add, to bring America back to a fabled time when Christians were the sole arbiter of American moral life, American religious pluralism is now the de facto mode of American self-awareness. And that in small part explains the animosity and anger coming from conservative Christians today. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for a few questions. I'm looking at Jeff asking that. Yeah? Great. Right.
One of the themes that struck me going through almost all the papers we heard this morning is the disjuncture between myth and rhetoric versus reality. Came out strongly in this last paper, for instance. But I'd like to address my question to Professor Sanchez-Walsh in particular. You mentioned Diane West as someone who wrote about conspiracy theories, and she referred to the Office of Refugee Settlement. Now that's interesting to me because in all this rhetoric about the rule of law, when we're dealing with the mass migration of child migrants recently, no one seemed to recognize that there is a law about refugees. So people talk all about laws, you know, that we should be protecting the border more, and that's, you know, the rule of law at work and so forth. But they seem to ignore the fact that refugee policy, which would apply to at least some of these child migrants, is also part of the rule of law. So I'm wondering if, how does this cognitive dissonance keep, Americans acting in this way? How is it that we continue to believe that this is a very religiously diverse country when in fact it is not? I mean, are we continually deluding ourselves about these things when the facts seem to show otherwise? I'd be interested in your comment on that.
Okay. The debate was with the unaccompanied minors is if they should be called refugees at all. So part of the process of dehumanizing and destabilizing this narrative is to suggest that they are essentially covers for gang members, drug runners, and in particular with children, that they're carriers of disease. And that is not a new trope. That has been used several times before, predominantly in the beginning of the 20th century, to enforce mass fumigation of Mexican migrants over the border, where there were stations all along this border here, to fumigate Mexican workers who are going back and forth to work, mostly in railroads and other towns along the border. So you don't talk about worker rights, you don't talk about health laws. It was a public health issue. So if you spin that to say this is a matter of public health, then you essentially in the 1920s and 30s had a right to fumigate Mexican workers, while you never fumigated white people, white missionaries in particular, going back and forth doing their missions work. With unaccompanied minors, it's the same thing. They are not refugees, because giving them refugee status creates a whole other set of legal problems that Tea Party activists would rather not talk about. They benefit greatly from maintaining their facts, essentially, that these are people of questionable means, they're criminals, and that they are, what she said is clear, is that these are unassimilatable people, that they are coming to so radically change the nature of this country that something has to be done. And so it's alarmist, it's rhetoric. Why does it still work? I don't know. I don't live in Texas. I don't vote here. So maybe I live in California. So we do things differently there. I don't know. But why does it work? It works because it feeds into a centuries-old trope of Latin American people as being un-American and being viewed as existential threats to an imagined America that never existed. As my colleague here will mention about pluralism, I'll let him deal with that. But it's maintaining a protected order, and I think that's why it works very successfully for centuries.
Thank you. Another? Yeah.
Well, ironically, my question or interest is also in refugee resettlement. I founded a committee on refugees within the Dallas United Nations Association here many years ago, and it fosters volunteerism for all the resettlement and asylum and other service-providing agencies. But I was interested in what you said about the rising anti-Muslim sentiment in the current political climate, and I have noticed that here too. Although most people are welcoming, there are often protesters from various camps that claim, the refugees who are coming are changing the face of the United States, they're taking jobs, the usual arguments. But another facet that I was interested in what your observations might be would be that since most of the resettlement agencies are faith-based, and all of the faiths, the major Abrahamic faiths are represented here too, but those that are evangelical Christian in their mission sometimes do interweave provision of social services with subtle or not so subtle nudging toward accepting Christianity along with the refugee resettlement process. So I'm really just interested in any observations you might have on refugee resettlement and religion these days.
Well, though I don't recommend it as purely a form of information, you should all look at Refugee Resettlement Watch. I certainly would not, even if I accepted kickbacks from them, I wouldn't take it. But it's an intriguing site in terms of they don't like anybody. So essentially, Catholics, United Methodists, Jewish groups, all are dupes in this grand conspiracy to undermine the fabric of the country. And what the fabric of the country is for this particular group of people is the demographic fabric. That this refugee resettlement, this latest wave, is essentially a money-making scheme for refugee resettlement officers who apparently are making scads of money on the side doing this work. And the point is not really to provide evidence. It's simply to link to all these other sites of where the buses are coming, who's coming, what laws are being passed underneath people's noses to ensure that we get massive, the latest ones, see the unaccompanied minors is not an issue anymore. The latest issues in Refugee Resettlement Watch are refugees or immigrants from Africa and the attempts to scare up the Ebola scare and to suggest that that is too part of the plot. So it's unusual logic, to say the least, but if you're interested in kind of how your work is portrayed amongst, and I don't even call them the extreme right, I think it's just basically the right. Just take a look at it.
I'm afraid we have to wrap up. Let's thank our panelists one more time for those excellent presentations.
Our Q&A program is 10 years old now, and to mark a decade